Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about what is science. I thought we would start this lecture by saying what science is not. Science is not, as it seems, portrayed in the movies and TV shows. Science in reality is a lot more tedious, but also much more powerful in the composite body of knowledge that it creates. Science is also not a god. Oftentimes we hear the phrase that science tells us as if there's some supernatural being out there that confers wisdom and information. It's also not a bolt of lightning that science has occurred and brought us information. In reality, science is a process of testing explanations about how the world works. And the fact that it's a process is a key. It's sometimes very slow, sometimes very grinding, but the fact is that it continues as a process where we test and retest explanations to build some confidence about our ideas that explain how the world works. So what is science all about? Science as we know it really got its start in the 17th century. First of all, with empiricism. Empiricism is this idea that you can observe information with your own senses and make some sense of the world. So for example, in 1665, Robert Hooke observed a cell through his newly invented microscope. And because he observed a cell, he could see it with his own eyes, and therefore he understood that cells exist and helps us build towards this theory about the building blocks of life. The other idea important at this time is the idea of rationalism. And this is concerning the fact that we can make logical explanations about the world. And Descartes in 1637 invented Cartesian coordinates that allow us to test mathematical properties and use logical reasoning to understand processes in the world. So the twin concepts of observation and reasoning bring meaning to the natural world. We can observe events occurring, we can observe things like cells, and we can reason about the processes and the characteristics that tie these observations together. So we could say that science is driven by both evidence and theory. Evidence, to be considered scientific evidence, has to be primarily observable, usually material, and often open to challenge. So observable evidence, either through our own senses or through scientific instruments, is generally material evidence, and people are constantly checking and rechecking the validity of evidence, how strong it is, whether it was actually something that people observed or whether it was a quirk of memory, for example. And together these characteristics build what we call evidence or data or facts. Theory follows this line of reasoning. Theory is a well-substantiated explanation of the natural world acquired through the scientific method. And two phrases are key here: well-substantiated and scientific method. So scientific method is this process of constantly checking and rechecking. And if you check many, many times and you always get the same answer, then we consider a theory to be well-substantiated, very well checked by many scientists. So in fact, electricity is a theory. Our explanation about the electromagnetic properties of atoms has been constantly checked and rechecked and is now very well substantiated through this process of testing. So why do we have theories? Theories are important for three reasons. First of all, you probably is not the first thing that comes to mind, but theories tell us what we are studying. So I'm going to put these up so I can show you the picture. Cell theory, for example, defines the properties of life. Defines cells as the basic unit of life. So it actually informs us what we're studying when we talk about what a cell is. Cell theory can also generate questions about the world. If this is how we define the basic unit of life, we can look at things like viruses and try to decide whether they're alive or not. And theories also make facts matter. So it is a fact that there are 30 people enrolled in our summer session course. Does that matter? Well, it depends on the theory that you're looking at. For cell theory, probably not so much. If we're interested in educational processes and processes of learning, then that fact might become relevant. So there's a lot of facts in the world, there's a lot of information in the world, but their relevance for scientists only comes under what theory they're examining. So these last two, if you're interested in knowing this, it won't be on the exam, are known as deductive and inductive reasoning. So generating questions based on principles to look at new specific instances of evidence is considered to be deductive reasoning. This is point 2. And using specific instances to understand general principles, point number 3, is known as inductive reasoning. Now, theories are often tested using hypotheses. So theories are concepts that give rise to hypotheses. Hypotheses are more specific, testable statements. So while cell theory might define the properties of cells as the basic unit of life, hypotheses look at more specific instances like certain types of cells or certain aspects of life for which we can collect bodies of evidence or facts. And if you are a fan of Indiana Jones, you'll know that archaeology is the search for fact, not truth. And in fact, from a scientific viewpoint, facts and theories do not and never equal truth. Truth is outside the realm of scientific inquiry because truth is not questionable, it's the truth. And we can only build confidence in theories via the facts that we collect as we continually test and retest them. And I actually find this very comforting, the fact that we're constantly checking what we know, constantly checking and rechecking. So what makes a theory scientific? I mean, I could say theoretically it should rain tomorrow, but that's not a scientific theory. We have some specific properties, such as scientific theories are about tangible, observable entities with discoverable and causal relations. So here's these two ideas of empiricism and rationality, collecting observable data that we can then logically think about the causal and discoverable relations. They're also specific to knowledge open to certain kinds of questioning, so it has to be testable. If we can't answer our questions, we can't test hypotheses and we can't build theories. Robust scientific theories are those that are productive, they generate new questions, they're testable, they allow us to collect data and evidence and answer our questions. They're explanatory, they generally explain larger bodies of hypotheses, and they converge with other theories. So this is that idea of consilience. So let's look at a specific example of scientific methodology. How do we go about doing science? Well, first of all, we would identify a pattern, either a pattern in evidence, or we have a theory that we're using to look at a pattern of evidence. We would state a hypothesis, a more specific, testable statement. We'll then go out and collect some evidence, and then we'll test the hypothesis using our evidence, and we will either accept or modify our hypothesis. So let's identify a pattern. This is the pattern of lactose tolerance around the world. If you're lactose intolerant, you can't digest milk sugars as an adult. And the countries with brighter red colors have high percentages of lactose intolerant adults. Brighter green reflects higher percentages of lactose tolerant adults, those who can digest milk sugars into adulthood. And you can see in particular that North America and Australia, the Aboriginal or Indigenous populations, the American Indians and the Australian Aborigines are red. In fact, the green mostly results from European colonists. So we generally see two areas of the world, Northern Europe and Central Africa, where lactose tolerance is occurring. So let's state a hypothesis. Remember, it has to be testable. It's usually quite specific. It's easier to test the more specific it is. And don't forget that multiple hypotheses are possible explanations for the processes under study, and oftentimes hypotheses are in competition with one another as people try to collect more evidence and support their ideas about how the world works. So our hypothesis is going to be that lactose tolerance occurs in populations with a history of dairying, or a cultural history of raising animals to produce milk that will be consumed by adults. So we can collect some evidence. These can be observations or experiments. If we look at Northern Europe, we see that there is indeed a cultural history of dairying, of raising livestock for milk production, and you can imagine that the other area of the world with a history of dairying is Central Africa. And scientists have also collected information on the DNA of these populations, because there's a genetic mutation that occurred once upon a time to allow adults to continue digesting milk. And in fact, there are 4 different mutations that evolved separately in these populations that allow adults to be lactose tolerant. So then we can test our hypothesis. We accept, reject, or modify. And in this case, the evidence supports the hypothesis, so we would accept it. We can also then use our hypothesis to explain perhaps other populations who are lactose intolerant, to predict where we might see lactose tolerance arise, and possibly refute other bodies of data. And this is just a picture of how lactose is broken down by lactase. And of course, we would continue testing and retesting these hypotheses. So which of these is not a hypothesis? A little mini quiz for you. And you can pause the video if you want some time to think about the answer. So remember, the key idea here is testability, and the number that you're least able to test is number 3, until someone has gone back in time, or invented a time machine so we can go back in time, and a certain way that we could observe a creator. This is the least testable idea, so we would consider this to be not a hypothesis. That's not saying it's not necessarily true or credible or valid as a way of understanding the world. It's just not a scientific hypothesis, since it's not a statement. And so since this is a science class, we're going to be limiting ourselves to empirical data that we can test scientifically. One limitation that people often misunderstand about theories is that theories never stop being theories. Scientific theories can be more or less supported, more or less robust, because, as we said earlier, the absolute truth is outside the scientific method, since it is beyond question. So electricity as a theory is very robust, very well supported, but we will continue testing it, and we will never consider it to be absolute truth, because we want to be able to continue testing it. So theories is kind of where our confidence stops. And again, this is very comforting, because we're constantly reassuring ourselves about our explanations for the world. So when we say that evolution is just a theory, it's not just a theory the way I would say theoretically it will rain tomorrow. Evolution is a robust scientific theory that generates and powers multiple convergent lines of scientific inquiry. It generates many hypotheses, it generates many new questions, hundreds and millions of hours of data collection over the last 150 years have constantly reaffirmed our idea about the process of evolution, and we can explain a lot about the natural world through the theory of evolution and the hypothesis that it generates. So it's not just a theory, it's a robust scientific theory. So we'll talk more about what evolution is in the next presentation, and thanks for listening.